Hi, welcome to Audiobook Academy. This is a self-paced audiobook. There's no need to keep an eye on things. Just pay attention. Thank you for taking the time to listen. Book summary of Decisive by Chip and Dan Heath. Processor and Dan Heath make a decisive decision. In decision-making, the four main villains are 1. Narrow framing, 2. Confirmation bias, 3. Short-term emotion, and 4. Overconfidence. Avoid making decisions based on whether or not. Instead, consider a number of alternatives at the same time. Is there anyone else who is dealing with a problem like mine, and what can I learn from them? You might wonder. When gathering useful information and putting your ideas through their paces, consult with an expert. Rather than selecting all or nothing, select a little something instead. The psychologist Daniel Kahneman claims that we make snap judgments because we place too much emphasis on information that is immediately in front of us while failing to take into account information that is just off stage. In his words, what you see is all there is. This tendency is also referred to as the spotlight effect. What's in the spotlight will rarely provide us with all of the information we require to make an informed decision, but we won't always remember to adjust the lighting. It is possible that we will lose sight of the spotlight altogether, spending so much time in the small circle of light that we will forget that there is a broader landscape beyond it. The approach to decision-making that relies on pros and cons is fundamentally flawed. If we want to make better decisions, we must first understand how the four villains of decision-making operate and then learn how to combat them. The four villains of decision-making are discussed in Chapter 1. It is our tendency to define our choices too narrowly and to see them in binary terms that is known as narrow framing. Narrow framing is the first villain of decision-making. We have a tendency to form an opinion about a situation quickly and then seek out information that supports our opinion. This is referred to as the confirmation bias, and it is the second villain in the world of decision-making. The researchers found that when people have the opportunity to gather information from the outside world, they are more likely to choose information that supports their pre-existing attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. Professor Dan Lovallo believes that confirmation bias is probably the single biggest problem in business, because even the most sophisticated people make mistakes when it comes to making decisions. The data is being collected while people are out and about, and they are completely unaware that they are cooking the books. When we want something to be true, we will draw attention to the evidence that supports it, and then, when we draw conclusions from the evidence that has been drawn attention to, we will congratulate ourselves on making a well-informed decision. Short-term emotion is the third villain in the world of decision-making. Overconfidence is the fourth villain in the world of decision-making. The reality is that we know a lot less than we think we do about the future. We have a disproportionate amount of faith in our own predictions. When we make educated guesses about the future, we focus our attention on information that is readily available and then draw conclusions based on that information. The future has an uncanny ability to take you completely by surprise. It's impossible to bring attention to areas where we don't even know they exist. When you think about a typical decision-making process, you'll notice that it usually involves 4 steps. 1. You are presented with a decision. 2. You conduct a thorough examination of your options. 3. You must make a decision. 4. Then you just have to deal with it. The problem, however, is that each of these stages is plagued by a villain who can be identified as follows. You are presented with a decision. However, narrow framing causes you to miss out on other possibilities. You conduct a thorough examination of your options. However, confirmation bias leads you to gather information that is beneficial to you. You must make a decision. However, short-term emotions will frequently tempt you to make the incorrect decision. Then you just have to deal with it. However, you will frequently be overconfident in your ability to predict the future. Our biases cannot be deactivated, but they can be mitigated by applying the appropriate discipline. The acronym RAP summarizes the 4 actions that must be taken in order to protect yourself from the biases listed above. 1. Increase the number of people who opt in. 2. Put your assumptions to the test in the real world. 3. Prior to making a decision, get some distance. 4. Prepare yourself to be proven wrong. Knowing that a decision needs to be made is sometimes the most difficult part of making a good decision. Chapter 2, Avoid using a limited frame. When Fishoff began categorizing the decisions made by teenagers, he discovered that the most common type was one in which they had no choice at all. A statement of resolve, as he put it, would be something like "I'm going to stop blaming other people." In a 1993 study by Paul Nutt, who examined 168 decisions, he discovered that only 29% of the teams he studied considered more than one alternative in their decision-making. Nutt discovered that whether or not decisions failed 52% of the time over the long term, compared to only 32% of the decisions involving two or more alternatives, according to the study. Why do whether or not decisions fail more frequently than other decisions? The manager, according to Nutt, spends the majority of her time asking, "How can I make this work?" when she is pursuing a single option. "What can I do to enlist the support of my co-workers?" Meanwhile, other critical questions are left unanswered, such as, "Is there a better way? Was there anything else we could do?" To avoid being trapped in narrow frames, be mindful of whether or not decisions. It is a term borrowed from economics that refers to the value of the opportunity cost associated with a given decision. For example, if you and your spouse spend $40 on a Mexican dinner one Friday night and then spend $20 to go to the movies, your opportunity cost could be $60 for a sushi dinner and some television at home. Sushi and television is the next best thing you could have done with the same amount of time and money. Sushi and television is the next best thing you could have done with the same amount of time and money. Including more options improves the decision-making process. However, if you aren't aware that you are overlooking other options, you won't be able to come up with any new ideas. While focusing is beneficial for analyzing alternatives, it is detrimental for identifying them. Our failure to recognize and account for opportunity costs is so common that it can be surprising when someone does so consciously. What am I giving up by making this decision? Is a good quality question to ask yourself. Performing the vanishing options test is another technique that can be used to break free from a restrictive frame. This entails asking yourself the question, you are unable to choose any of the current options you are contemplating. Is there anything else you could do? Using the phrase whether or not is a classic red flag that you haven't thoroughly investigated all of your options. When people believe that they have no other choice, they are forced to shift their mental spotlight elsewhere, really shift it, often for the first time in a long time. It is likely that we will remain fixated on the options that we currently have until such time as we are compelled to find a new one. People can benefit from removing options because it draws their attention to the fact that they are trapped in a small portion of a large landscape. As soon as you notice signs of a narrow frame, people debating whether or not they should make a particular decision or rehashing arguments about the same limited set of options, ask them to broaden their perspective. Chapter 3 is titled Multitrack. Multitracking is the process of considering several options at the same time. Another advantage of multitracking is that it has the potential to be unexpected. It makes me feel better. Multitracking helps to keep egos under control. Keeping looking for options until you've fallen in love with someone at least twice is a good rule of thumb when interviewing job candidates. There is some evidence to suggest that excessive multitracking is harmful. Incorporating one more alternative into your decision-making process will significantly improve your decisions and will keep you from falling into decision paralysis entirely. In most situations, decision paralysis is not a significant factor. You do not require a plethora of options in order to make better decisions. It's only a matter of adding one or two more options. In order to reap the benefits of multitracking, we must create options that are meaningfully distinct from one another. In order to determine whether your colleagues have created genuine or fictitious options, ask them for their preferences. When our minds become accustomed to certain well-worn grooves, it becomes even more difficult to generate distinct options. When we think about avoiding bad things, we get into a groove, and when we think about pursuing good things, we get into a groove. When we're in one state, we have a tendency to ignore what's happening in another. A prevention focus, in which we are concerned with avoiding negative outcomes, and a promotion focus, in which we are concerned with pursuing positive outcomes, have been identified by psychologists as two opposing mindsets that influence our motivation and openness to new opportunities. The best decisions may be those that combine the caution of the prevention mindset with the zeal of the promotion mindset, says the author. Instead of saying this and that, insist on this and that. Find someone who has already solved your problem in Chapter 4. Is there anyone else who is dealing with a problem like mine, and what can I learn from them? You might wonder. When we want to break free from a narrow frame, we need options, and one of the most fundamental ways to generate fresh alternatives for a problem is to find someone else who has already solved it. When it comes to solving problems, sometimes the people who come up with the best solutions are our own colleagues. Bright spots are a natural part of your environment. It is your own success that you are attempting to replicate. Please note that Switch contains additional information on bright spots. In a playlist, you can find questions to ask, philosophical principles to consult, and ideas to ponder. When planning a marketing campaign, for example, you might ask yourself the following questions. What kind of iconography is useful within the brand, and what kind of environment could we create around it? Is there a signature color for the company? What is the product's greatest adversary? What would the brand look and feel like if it had the largest market share? What if it was a startup company? Is it possible to personify the product? Playlists incite us to use multiple tracks. Analogy is a reliable but underappreciated pillar of scientific thinking, according to the author. In other words, when you use analogies, when you find someone who has already solved your problem, you have the opportunity to choose from the world's buffet of solutions. But if you don't bother to look, you'll have to come up with a solution on your own. For those who are stuck, a technique known as laddering up can help them find their way out. Because the conditions are so similar, the lower rungs of the ladder provide a view of situations that are very similar to yours. Any visible solutions will have a high likelihood of success because the conditions are so similar. The more you progress up the ladder, the more options you'll see that come from other domains, but some of those options will require you to use your imagination. Chapter 5, take a look at the opposite. In order to make good decisions, CEOs must have the courage to seek out and confront disagreement. According to one meta-study, confirmation bias was more prevalent in emotionally charged domains such as religion or politics, as well as when people had a strong underlying motivation to believe one way or the other, among other things. When people have previously invested a significant amount of time or effort in a particular issue, confirmation bias increases. The first step in reality testing the assumptions you're making is to cultivate the discipline to consider options that are diametrically opposed to our first instincts. The willingness to engage in constructive disagreement is the first step in developing discipline. We would prefer to avoid the temporary discomfort of being challenged, but it is preferable to the pain of walking into a bad decision without thinking about it. Whenever you're debating between two options, ask yourself, what has to be true for this option to be the best choice? What if our least favorite option turned out to be the best option after all? What evidence might persuade us that this is the case? Sometimes we fool ourselves into thinking we're gathering information when we're actually looking for assistance. How do you know when to ask probing questions and when to ask open-ended questions? A good rule of thumb is to ask yourself, what is the most likely scenario in which I will be unable to obtain the correct information in this situation? According to the researchers, confirmation bias does not only influence what information people seek, it also influences what information they notice in the first place. Our professional relationships are sometimes tainted by negative assumptions that build up over time and cause problems. When it comes to dealing with coworkers, some organizational leaders advise their employees to assume positive intent, which means to believe that the behavior or words of their colleagues are motivated by good intentions, even when their actions appear to be objectionable at first glance, in order to avoid negativity. Figure 6. Zoom out, zoom in Chapter 6. Taking an outside perspective does not necessitate defeatism, but it does necessitate consideration of the most likely outcomes. There are times when people can have access to the best possible information and still choose to ignore it. When you're trying to gather good information and put your ideas through their paces, you should consult with an expert. An expert is simply someone who has accumulated more knowledge and experience than you do. In short, when you require reliable information, seek the advice of an expert, someone who has more knowledge and experience than you. All you have to do is keep them talking about the past and present, rather than the future. Because base rates are effective at establishing norms, the following are the outcomes that we can anticipate if we proceed with this decision. Close-ups, on the other hand, elicit intuition, which can be just as important as knowledge. Another type of close-up involves going to the genba, which is a Japanese term that literally translates as the real place or, more loosely, the location where the action takes place. The insider's perspective is our assessment of our particular situation. The outsider's perspective equals how things typically unfold in situations similar to ours. Although the outside view is more accurate, the inside view is preferred by the majority of people. A close-up can add texture to a photograph that would otherwise be lacking. We should zoom in and out in order to gather the most accurate information. From the outside, with a close-up. Ouch! That's the title of Chapter 7. To ouch is to design small experiments to test one's hypothesis in a controlled environment. Rather than choosing between all and nothing, we should choose a little something. Using this strategy, finding a way to ouch before we leap, is another way to reality check our assumptions. Our decision is informed by our real-world experience, which we call ouch. Ouching is a bad idea in situations where we need to make a commitment, but it is ideal in situations where we genuinely need more information. In a nutshell, ouching should be used to expedite the gathering of reliable information rather than to delay a decision that deserves our full attention. Through interviews, we attempt to predict success. Instead, we should ouch it up. Chapter 8, Overcome Emotions of the Short Term. We must place less emphasis on short-term emotions and more emphasis on long-term values and passions. To conduct October 10, 2010 analysis, consider a decision from 3 different perspectives. How will you feel about it in 10 minutes? How will you feel about it in 10 years? What do you think about 10 months from now? In 10 years' time, what will be the situation? A October 10, 2010 analysis does not imply that the long-term perspective is the best one to take in any given situation. It simply ensures that short-term emotions aren't the only ones who speak at the table during discussions. The mere exposure principle, which states that people develop a preference for things that are more familiar to them, has been the subject of decades of research by psychologists, i.e., merely being exposed to something makes us view it more positively. After exposing people to various stimuli, including nonsense words, Chinese-style characters, and photographs of faces, Robert Zients discovered that the more they were exposed to the stimuli, the more positive their feelings toward them became. The mere exposure principle is a more subtle form of short-term emotion than the other two. This preference for the status quo is exacerbated by another bias known as loss aversion, which states that we find losses to be more painful than gains to be. It appears that we set ourselves up for loss aversion almost immediately, according to the research. Combining these two forces, the mere exposure principle and loss aversion, results in a powerful bias for the way things work in the real world today. A relatively new area of psychology research, referred to as Construal level theory, demonstrates that gaining more distance from a problem allows us to see more clearly the most important dimensions of the problem we're facing. A second advantage of the advice we give to others is that it helps us. When it comes to advising people to ignore their short-term emotions, we tend to be cautious. The advice we give others has 2 significant advantages. It naturally prioritizes the most important factors in the decision and it minimizes the impact of short-term emotions on that decision. It is possible that the single most effective question for assisting us in making a decision is, what would I tell my best friend to do if he or she were in this situation? We are tempted to make decisions based on fleeting emotions that will be detrimental in the long run. We must gain some distance from our distracting short-term emotions in order to overcome them. In addition to providing distance, the October 10, 2010 analysis forces us to consider future emotions in the same way that we consider present emotions. Our decisions are frequently influenced by 2 subtle short-term emotions: 1, mere exposure, we prefer what we are familiar with, and 2, loss aversion, losses are more painful than gains. Loss aversion combined with mere exposure results in status quo bias. By viewing our situation from the perspective of an observer, we can gain some distance from ourselves. Probably the most effective question to ask when making decisions about one's own life is, what would I tell my best friend to do in this situation? Chapter 9, Make Your Core Priorities a Priority. The purpose of the RAP process is not to neutralize emotional responses. On the contrary, in fact. What's left at the core of decision-making after you take away all the rational mechanics of it, the generation of options, the weighing of information, is emotion. Can you tell me what motivates you? What kind of person do you want to be when you grow up? What do you believe will be the best long-term decision for your family? What kind of organization do you aspire to run? What's best for your team in the long run? Business leaders inquire. Those are emotional questions. They speak to passions, values, and beliefs, and when you answer them, there is no rational machine beneath the surface that is generating your perspective, says the researcher. What matters is who you are and what you want in your life. Emotion is where the buck stops. When we clearly define and enshrine our priorities, our decisions are more consistent and less agonizing, says the author of the book. Until they're forced to, people rarely establish their priorities, says the author. Determining priorities is not the same as committing yourself to them, says the author. Think back over your week's schedule and ask yourself, what specific things would I have given up in order to carve out the extra 3, 4, or 5 hours that I'll require? The author, Peter Bregman, recommends that people set a timer that beeps once every hour, and that when it beeps, they should ask themselves, am I doing the most important thing right now? The most important long-term emotional values, goals, and aspirations are the most important. The ability to identify and enshrine your core priorities makes it easier to resolve present and future dilemmas, according to the author. The offensive against lesser priorities must be pursued in order to create space for our core priorities to be pursued. Chapter 10, The Future is Bookended by the Present. According to the researchers, when people use the second style of thinking, working backward from a specific future with prospective hindsight, they are more successful at generating explanations for why an event might occur. Team members use a failure mode and effects analysis (FMEA) to identify what could go wrong at every step of their plans. They then ask 2 questions for each potential failure, such as, how likely is it? As well as how severe would the ramifications be? Then, after assigning a score between 1 and 10 to each variable, they multiply the 2 numbers together to get a total. The highest totals, which represent the most serious potential failures, receive the most attention. A Prepper 8 asks us to consider the possibility of success. Let's say a year from now, our decision has proven to be a rousing success. A parade will be held in our honor, which is absolutely fantastic. How can we ensure that we are prepared for the future in light of it? The future is not a single scenario that we must predict in order to be successful. It is a range of possibilities. When planning for the future, we should take into account a range of outcomes, from very bad to very good. We need to conduct a pre-mortem in order to prepare for the lower bookend. It will be 1 year from now. Our decision has been a complete and utter failure. Why? In order to be prepared for the upper bookend, we need to practice. It will be 1 year from now. We're heroes in this story. Will we be prepared to achieve success? The term safety factor refers to something that can be used to prepare for something that cannot be predicted. Being able to anticipate problems allows us to better deal with them. By bookending our decisions, that is, anticipating and preparing for both adversity and success, we stack the deck in our favor, says the author. Creating a tripwire in Chapter 11 is important. In order to break us out of our unconscious routines, tripwires must first make us aware that we have a choice to make. In the end, the virtue of being persistent turns into the vice of denying reality, writes the author. Pilots are taught to pay close attention to what are known as lemurs, which are vague feelings that something isn't quite right, even if it isn't immediately obvious what it is. Having a label for those feelings gives them legitimacy, and pilots are less likely to dismiss them as unfounded. It takes only a split second to recognize that this is a lemur, and the body shifts abruptly from autopilot to manual control, from unconscious to conscious behavior. When we're living our lives, we naturally fall into autopilot mode, not questioning our previous decisions. A tripwire can jolt us out of our stupor and force us to recognize that we have a choice. Tripwires can be particularly useful when there is a gradual transition. Deadlines and partitions are good options for people who are stuck on autopilot. We have a tendency to increase our investment in bad decisions. Partitions can assist us in reining that in. Tripwires have the potential to create a safe environment for risk-taking. They serve 2 purposes: 1, to limit risk, and 2, to keep your mind quiet until the trigger is pulled. The use of patterns rather than dates, metrics, or budgets can set off a lot of powerful tripwires. Tripwires can bring us to a valuable realization: we have a choice to make, says the author. Chapter 12, Putting Your Faith in the Process. When it comes to determining how people feel about a decision, procedural justice is critical. People must be able to perceive that a fair process is being followed, says the author. A dependable process can assist us in navigating even the most difficult of decisions. It isn't glamorous to be in the process. However, the confidence it can instill is extremely valuable. Putting our faith in a process can free us to take bigger risks and make more daring decisions. According to research conducted on the elderly, people regret not what they did, but what they did not do. Thank you for listening in Audiobook Academy. Please don't forget to subscribe for more content like this. See you in next audiobook.